Why does belly fat get worse after 50, even when your life gets less stressful? Most people think cortisol is the problem, so they try to relax more, they avoid intense workouts, they cut back on anything that might spike stress hormones. But after working with thousands of patients over the age of 50 and reviewing the research on how cortisol actually behaves in midlife, I can tell you something most people don't realize. After 50, cortisol doesn't respond the way that it used to. And the strategies that worked in your 30s and in your 40s often stop working in your 50s. That's why so many people feel stuck. So in this video, I'm going to show you how cortisol actually works in your body, why it hits harder after 50, and the exact strategy that works with your biology instead of fighting it. Now, before we talk about what changes after 50, we need to understand what cortisol actually does in the first place. Most people think cortisol causes you to gain fat, but in short term, cortisol is actually designed to do the opposite. Its job is to pull energy out of storage. When it rises, your body releases stored sugar and fat so that you can use them. That includes body fat. So contrary to popular belief, cortisol isn't a storage hormone, it's a fuel hormone. That's why people with type 1 diabetes can have very high cortisol levels and a large appetite, yet they still lose weight rapidly. They struggle to store fat on their body because they don't produce enough insulin. So insulin is the real storage hormone, not cortisol. However, that doesn't mean you don't need to worry about cortisol levels. Short-term spikes are normal. It's our response to everyday stresses. But chronic elevation is very different. When cortisol stays high for long periods of time, it actually changes the environment inside the body. Because cortisol doesn't just release fat, it also tells your liver to release sugar, even if you haven't eaten anything. That's right, your liver can produce sugar all by itself, which means if cortisol is always elevated, your blood sugar stays elevated too. And when blood sugar stays elevated, your body releases insulin in response. And that's when the problem starts, because cortisol and insulin together change where fat is stored in your body. Here's how it works. Cortisol will continue breaking down fat in your arms and in your legs, and insulin will store that fat wherever cells are most responsive, which is often in your belly. That's why people with chronically elevated levels of these hormones tend to look the same. They have thin arms and thin legs with a thick waist. But it doesn't stop there. There's an enzyme in belly fat that can actually generate its own cortisol. So the more you have, the higher your cortisol levels get. That creates a vicious cycle. High cortisol levels increase blood sugar. The body responds by releasing insulin. The combination of cortisol and insulin moves your body's fat from your limbs to your belly. And as your belly fat grows, it generates even more cortisol. That's why you want to do something about chronically high cortisol levels, because otherwise your belly fat will balloon out of control. So now that you understand how that cycle works, let's talk about what changes after 50, because this is where most of the confusion begins. When you're younger, high cortisol is usually tied to obvious stress, work pressure, relationship problems, not sleeping enough, constant stimulation. And when we handle those sources of stress, cortisol often settles down with them. But after 50, that's not how it works. At that point, cortisol isn't just reacting to what's happening in your life, it's reacting to what's happening inside your body. It shifts from being mostly psychological mental stress to being largely biological. And that difference is very important for you to understand, because it means that after 50, even if your life gets calmer or less stressful, your cortisol levels can stay elevated still. So you need to understand the 5 biological changes that push cortisol higher in midlife. Otherwise, you'll spend your time chasing the wrong solutions. The first big change is that your stress response doesn't shut off as quickly. When you're 30, cortisol rises and falls fairly efficiently. After 50, it rises the same, but it doesn't fall as quickly. So even small stressors can leave a longer hormonal footprint. Second, your daily cortisol rhythm starts to flatten out. Cortisol is supposed to be highest in the morning to wake you up and lowest at night. That drop at night is what allows deep sleep to happen. But with age, that nighttime drop often isn't as strong. Cortisol stays slightly elevated into the evening. And when that happens, deep sleep suffers. That matters more than most people realize, because deep sleep is when your body releases the majority of its growth hormone. And growth hormone is one of the main hormones that helps your body burn fat and repair muscle. By the time you're in your 50s, growth hormone production has already declined by about 70 to 80% compared to peak levels in early adulthood. And if nighttime cortisol stays elevated on top of that, the window for repair gets even smaller. At the same time, muscle mass naturally declines with age, about 1 to 2% per year. And muscle is your biggest site for blood sugar control. It acts like a sponge. When you have more muscle, it can absorb more blood sugar without needing as much insulin. But when you have less muscle, more sugar stays in your bloodstream, which means your body has to release more insulin to deal with it. And that's not all. Hormones that once buffered cortisol's effects start to decline. In women, menopause changes where fat is stored. Estrogen used to direct more fat towards the hips and the thighs. When estrogen drops, storage shifts towards the abdomen. And we just talked about how that can turn into a vicious cycle of creating more belly fat and more cortisol. And then in men, testosterone gradually declines. Testosterone helps preserve muscle, counterbalances cortisol's breakdown effects. And when it falls, muscle declines even faster and belly fat becomes easier to store. Notice that none of these have anything to do with your environment. They're natural biological changes that happen to everybody. That's why simply reducing stress often isn't enough at this stage of life. You need a different strategy, one that addresses your biology, not just your psychology. The first place to start is muscle. We just talked about how muscle declines by 1 to 2% per year and how muscle acts like a sponge for blood sugar. So if you want to lower your insulin response that keeps belly fat locked in, you have to rebuild and preserve that sponge. That means resistance training, not endless cardio, not light toning, actual progressive resistance training that challenges your muscles and gives them a reason to grow. Aim for strength training or adding some weight to your workout 2 to 3 times per week. Focus on full body movements, step-ups, presses, rows. Use a weight that feels challenging to get in 8 to 12, maybe even 15 to 20 reps. Keep good form though, and prioritize controlled movements over speed. If you need some help on which exercises to completely avoid, I made exercises to avoid over the age of 50. It's very popular. I advise checking that one out. Now, before we go any further, let's clear up something that confuses a lot of people. There's a myth that you should avoid strenuous workouts because they spike cortisol. But like we just discussed, short-term spikes are not the problem. In fact, those short-term spikes help you bring your long-term cortisol levels down. It's similar to your heart rate. When you exercise, your heart rate goes up. But if you train consistently, your heart rate comes down over time. But you don't avoid exercise just because it temporarily raises your heart rate. The same principle applies to cortisol. Avoiding strength training just because it temporarily raises cortisol is missing the point. The right kind of intensity actually improves your resting cortisol levels over the long run, which brings us to the second strategy, high intensity interval training. When it's done correctly, HIIT temporarily raises cortisol. About an hour later, it starts to come down. And within roughly 2 hours, it can actually drop below where it started. Over time, that pattern trains your stress system to recover faster. In other words, short, controlled burst of intensity can lower your resting cortisol levels. The key is to keep exercise sessions short. If you drag the workout out too long, cortisol stays elevated instead of dropping back down, and it defeats the purpose. That's actually one of the main reasons why I created my 10-minute HIIT workouts. They're short enough to give you the stimulus that you need without creating unnecessary stress. If you want to give them a try, I put a link to 5 free 10-minute workouts in the description below. Now, strength training and HIIT both stimulate muscle, but muscle doesn't rebuild itself automatically. It needs protein. So after 50, your muscles are less sensitive to protein signals, which means you need enough protein to trigger that signal consistently. If your main focus is healthy aging and maintaining muscle, aim for 0.5 gram of protein per pound of body weight per day. If you're moderately active, walking regularly, doing lots of yoga or light exercises, maybe move closer to 0.75 grams per pound of body weight per day to support recovery. And if you're strength training, you're actively trying to lose fat, aim for about 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight per day. Some of the best sources: pasture-raised eggs, grass-fed beef, free-range chickens, wild-caught fish, Greek yogurt. If you can tolerate dairy, you could do a clean whey or a collagen shake. Just be careful of whey because whey has lactose, another form of sugar. It can raise blood sugar levels a little bit more. That's why I prefer collagen to get protein in. But getting enough high-quality protein throughout the day is crucial. Helps preserve and rebuild muscle tissue, and that directly improves your blood sugar control, which lowers insulin demand, which weakens the cortisol, insulin, belly fat loop that we talked about earlier. Next, you want to reduce the insulin spikes that keep fat locked in. One of the simplest ways to do that is post-meal walking, especially after dinner. The evening meal is often the largest meal of the day, and blood sugar tends to stay elevated longer at night. When you walk after a meal, your muscles pull sugar out of the bloodstream without needing as much insulin. Even 10 to 15 minutes makes a huge difference. Finally, you need to protect your nighttime drop in cortisol, because if cortisol stays elevated into the evening, deep sleep suffers. And if deep sleep suffers, growth hormone release suffers, which accelerates muscle loss and fat storage, especially in the belly. So avoid stacking stress late at night. Don't do intense workouts right before bed. Try finishing eating several hours before sleep, and keep your sleep schedule consistent. These are changes that address the biological drivers of high cortisol. And once you correct the biology, belly fat finally starts to respond. Now, before you go, there's something you need to hear. If you're over 50 and your belly fat won't budge, cortisol might not even be the main reason. For a lot of people, the real problem is the liver, because when your liver shifts into storage mode, it doesn't matter how hard you train, it doesn't matter how clean you eat, your body will keep choosing to store fat instead of burn it. Most people have no idea it's happening. So in my next video, I'll show you the 6 specific food mistakes that clog your liver, quietly blocking fat burning, even in people who think they're eating healthy. So if you want to finally understand why your belly fat isn't moving, click right here and watch that video next. You'll never look at your food the same way again.